I'm Dawn, and we're reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. We return to the study as Basil tries to convince Dorian to show him the painting. Yes, I don't suppose you will object to that. Georges Petit is going to collect all my best pictures for a special exhibition in the Rue de César, which will open the first week in October. The portrait will only be away a month. I should think you could easily spare it for that time. In fact, you're sure to be out of town, and if you hide it always behind a screen, you can't care much about it. Dorian Gray passed his hand over his forehead. There were beads of perspiration there. He felt that he was on the brink of a horrible danger. You told me a month ago that you would never exhibit it, he said. Why have you changed your mind? You people who go in for being consistent have just as many moods as others. The only difference is that your moods are rather meaningless. You can't have forgotten that you assured me most solemnly that nothing in the world would induce you to send it to any exhibition. You told Harry the exact same thing. He stopped suddenly, and a gleam of light came into his eyes. He remembered that Lord Henry had said to him once, half seriously and half in jest, "If you want to have an interesting quarter of an hour, get Basil to tell you why he won't exhibit your picture." He told me why he wouldn't, and it was a revelation to me. Yes, perhaps Basil, too, had his secret. He would ask him and try. "Basil," he said, coming over quite close and looking him straight in the face, "we have each of us a secret. Let me know yours, and I will tell you mine. What was your reason for refusing to exhibit my picture?" Hallward shuddered in spite of himself. "Dorian, if I told you, you might like me less than you do, and you would most certainly laugh at me. I could not bear your doing either of those two things. If you wish me never to look at your picture again, I am content. I have always you to look at. If you wish the best work I have ever done to be hidden from the world, I am satisfied. Your friendship is dearer to me than any fame or reputation." "No, Basil, you must tell me," murmured Dorian Gray. "I think I have a right to know." His feeling of terror had passed away, and curiosity had taken its place. He was determined to find out Basil Hallward's mystery. "Let us sit down, Dorian," said Hallward, looking pale and pained. "Let us sit down. I will sit in the shadow, and you shall sit in the sunlight. Our lives are like that. Just answer me the one question. Have you noticed in the picture something that you did not like? Something that probably at first did not strike you, but that revealed itself to you suddenly?" "Basil!" cried the lad, clutching the arms of his chair with trembling hands and gazing at him with wild, startled eyes. "I see you did. Don't speak. Wait till you hear what I have to say. It is quite true that I have worshipped you with far more reverence of feeling than a man usually gives to a friend. Somehow I had never loved a woman. I suppose I never had the time. Perhaps, as Harry says, a really grand passion is the privilege of those who have nothing to do, and that is the use of the idle classes in a country. Well, from the moment I met you, your personality had the most extraordinary influence over me. I quite admit that I adored you madly, extravagantly, absurdly. I was jealous of every one to whom you spoke. I wanted to have you all to myself. I was only happy when I was with you. When I was away from you, you were still present in my art. It was all wrong and foolish. It is all wrong and foolish still. Of course, I never let you know anything about this. It would have been impossible. You would have not understood it. I did not understand it myself. One day, I determined to paint a wonderful portrait of you. It was to have been my masterpiece. It is my masterpiece. But as I worked at it, every flake and film of color seemed to me to reveal my secret. I grew afraid that the world would know of my idolatry. I felt, Dorian, that I had told too much. Then it was that I resolved never to allow the picture to be exhibited. You were a little annoyed, but then you did not realize all that it meant to me. Harry, to whom I talked about it, laughed at me, but I did not mind that. When the picture was finished and I sat alone with it, I felt that I was right. Well, after a few days, the portrait left my studio. And as soon as I had got rid of the intolerable fascination of its presence, it seemed to me that I had been foolish in imagining that I had said anything in it, more than that you were extremely good-looking and that I could paint. Even now, I cannot help feeling that it is a mistake to think that the passion one feels in creation is ever really shown in the work one creates. Art is more abstract than we fancy. Form and color tell us of form and color. That is all. It often seems to me that art conceals the artist far more completely than it ever reveals him. And so, when I got this offer from Paris, I determined to make your portrait the principal thing in my exhibition. It never occurred to me that you would refuse. I see now that you were right. The picture must not be shown. You must not be angry with me, Dorian, for what I have told you. As I said to Harry once, you are made to be worshipped. Dorian Gray drew a long breath. The color came back to his cheeks, and a smile played about his lips. The peril was over. He was safe for the time. Yet he could not help feeling infinite pity for the young man who had just made this strange confession to him. He wondered if he would ever be so dominated by the personality of a friend. Lord Harry had the charm of being very dangerous, but that was all. He was too clever and too cynical to be really fond of. Would there ever be someone who would fill him with a strange idolatry? Was that one of the things that life had in store? It is extraordinary to me, Dorian, said Hallward, that you should have seen this in the picture. Did you really see it? Of course I did. Well, you don't mind my looking at it now? Dorian shook his head. You must not ask me that, Basil. I could not possibly let you stand in front of that picture. You will someday, surely? Never. Well, perhaps you are right. And now, goodbye, Dorian. You have been the one person in my life of whom I have been really fond. I don't suppose I shall often see you again. You don't know what it cost me to tell you all that I have told you. My dear Basil, cried Dorian, what have you told me? Simply that you felt that you liked me too much. That is not even a compliment. It was not intended as a compliment. It was a confession. A very disappointing one. Why, what did you expect, Dorian? You didn't see anything else in the picture, did you? There was nothing else to see? No, there was nothing else to see. Why do you ask? But you mustn't talk about not meeting again or anything of that kind. You and I are friends, Basil, and we must remain so. You have got Harry, said Hallward sadly. Oh, Harry, cried the lad with a ripple of laughter. Harry spends his days in saying what is incredible and his evenings in doing what is improbable. Just the sort of life I would like to lead, but still, I don't think I would go to Harry if I was in trouble. I would sooner go to you, Basil. But you won't sit to me again? Impossible. You spoil my life as an artist by refusing, Dorian. No man comes across two ideal things. Few come across one. I can't explain it to you, Basil, but I must never sit to you again. I will come and have tea with you. That will be just as pleasant. Pleasanter for you, I'm afraid, murmured Hallward regretfully. And now, goodbye. I am sorry you won't let me look at the picture once again, but that can't be helped. I quite understand what you feel about it. As he left the room, Dorian Gray smiled to himself. Poor Basil! How little he knew of the true reason! And how strange it was that, instead of having been forced to reveal his own secret, he had succeeded, almost by chance, in wresting a secret from his friend. How much that strange confession explained to him! Basil's absurd fits of jealousy, his wild devotion, his extravagant panegyrics, his curious reticences. He understood them all now, and he felt sorry. There was something tragic in a friendship so colored by romance. He sighed and touched the bell. The portrait must be hidden away at all costs. He could not run such a risk of discovery again. It had been mad of him to have the thing remain, even for an hour, in a room to which any of his friends had access. Chapter 8. When his servant entered, he looked at him steadfastly and wondered if he had thought of peering behind the screen. The man was quite impassive and waited for his orders. Dorian lit a cigarette and walked over to the glass and glanced into it. He could see the reflection of Victor's face perfectly. It was like a placid mask of servility. There was nothing to be afraid of there. Yet he thought it best to be on his guard. Speaking very slowly, he told him to tell the housekeeper that he wanted to see her, and then go to the frame maker's and ask him to send 2 of his men round at once. It seemed to him that as the man left the room, he peered in the direction of the screen. Or was that only his fancy? After a few minutes, Mrs. Leaf, a dear old lady in a black silk dress, with a photograph of the late Mr. Leaf framed in a large gold brooch at her neck, and old-fashioned thread mittens on her wrinkled hands, bustled into the room. "Well, Master Dorian," she said, "what can I do for you? I beg your pardon, sir." Here came a courtesy. "I shouldn't call you Master Dorian any more, but, Lord bless you, sir, I have known you since you were a baby, and many's the trick you've played on poor old Leaf. Not that you were not always a good boy, sir, but boys will be boys, Master Dorian, and jam is a temptation to the young, isn't it, sir?" He laughed. "You must always call me Master Dorian, Leaf. I'll be very angry with you if you don't. And I assure you I am quite as fond of jam now as I used to be. Only when I am asked out to tea am I ever offered any. I want you to give me the key of the room at the top of the house." "The old schoolroom, Master Dorian? Why, it's full of dust. I must get it arranged and put it straight before you go into it. It's not fit for you to see, Master Dorian. It's not indeed." I don't want it put straight, Leaf. I only want the key." "Well, Master Dorian, you'll be covered with cobwebs if you goes into it. Why, it hasn't been opened for nearly 5 years, not since his lordship died." He winced at the mention of his dead uncle's name. He had hateful memories of him. "That does not matter, Leaf," he replied. "All I want is the key." "And here's the key, Master Dorian," said the old lady, after going over the contents of her bunch with tremulous, uncertain hands. "Here's the key. I'll have it off the ring in a moment. But you don't think of living up there, Master Dorian, and you so comfortable here?" "No, Leaf, I don't. I merely want to see the place, and perhaps store something in it, that's all." "Thank you, Leaf. I hope your rheumatism is better, and, mind you, send me up jam for breakfast." Mrs. Leaf shook her head. "Them foreigners don't understand jam, Master Dorian. They call it compote. But I'll bring it to you myself some morning if you lets me." "That will be very kind of you, Leaf," he answered, looking at the key, and, having made him an elaborate courtesy, the old lady left the room, her face wreathed in smiles. She had a strong objection to the French valet. It was a poor thing, she felt, for anyone to be born a foreigner. As the door closed, Dorian put the key in his pocket and looked around the room. His eye fell on a large purple satin coverlet heavily embroidered with gold, a splendid piece of late 17th century Venetian work that his uncle had found in a convent near Bologna. Yes, that would serve to wrap the dreadful thing in. It had perhaps served as a pall for the dead. Now it was to hide something that had a corruption of its own, worse than the corruption of death itself, something that would breed horrors and yet would never die. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be to the painted image on the canvas. They would mar its beauty and eat away its grace. They would defile it and make it shameful. And yet the thing would live on. It would always be alive. He shuddered, and for a moment he regretted that he had not told Basil the true reason why he had wished to hide the picture away. Basil would have helped him to resist Lord Henry's influence and the still more poisonous influences that came from his own temperament. The love that he bore him, for it really was love, had something noble and intellectual in it. It was not that mere physical admiration of beauty that is born of the senses and that dies when the senses tire. It was such love as Michelangelo had known, and Montaigne, and Winckelmann, and Shakespeare himself. Yes, Basil could have saved him, but it was too late now. The past could always be annihilated. Regret, denial, or forgetfulness could do that, but the future was inevitable. There were passions in him that would find their terrible outlet, dreams that would make the shadow of their evil real. He took up from the couch the great purple and gold texture that covered it, and, holding it in his hands, passed behind the screen. Was the face on the canvas viler than before? It seemed to him that it was unchanged, and yet his loathing of it was intensified. Gold hair, blue eyes, and rose-red lips, they were all there. It was simply the expression that it altered, that was horrible in its cruelty. Compared to what he saw in it of censure or rebuke, how shallow Basil's reproaches about Sybil Vance had been. How shallow, and of what little account! His own soul was looking out at him from the canvas and calling him to judgment. A look of pain came across his face, and he flung the rich pall over the picture. As he did so, a knock came at the door. He passed out as his servant entered. "The persons are here, monsieur." He felt that the man must be got rid of at once. He must not be allowed to know where the picture was being taken to. There was something sly about him, and he had thoughtful, treacherous eyes. Sitting down at the writing table, he scribbled a note to Lord Henry, asking to send him round something to read, and reminding him that they were to meet at 8:15 that evening. "Wait for an answer," he said, handing it to him, "and show the men in here." In 2 or 3 minutes there was another knock, and Mr. Ashton himself, the celebrated frame maker of South Audley Street, came in with a somewhat rough-looking young assistant. Mr. Ashton was a florid, red-whiskered little man whose admiration for art was considerably tempered by the inveterate impetuosity of most of the artists who dealt with him. As a rule, he never left his shop. He waited for people to come to him, but he always made an exception in favor of Dorian Gray. There was something about Dorian that charmed everybody. It was a pleasure even to see him. "What can I do for you, Mr. Gray?" he said, rubbing his fat, freckled hands. "I thought I would do myself the honor of coming round in person. I've got just a beauty of a frame, sir. Picked it up at a sale. Old Florentine. Came from Fonthill, I believe. Admirably suited for a religious picture, Mr. Gray." "I'm so sorry you have given yourself the trouble of coming around, Mr. Ashton. I will certainly drop in and look at the frame, though I don't go in much for religious art. But today I only want a picture carried to the top of the house for me. It is rather heavy, so I thought I would ask you to lend me a couple of your men." "No trouble at all, Mr. Gray." I'm delighted to be of any service to you. Which is the work of art, sir? This, replied Dorian, moving the screen back. Can you move it, covering and all, just as it is? I don't want it to get scratched going upstairs. There'll be no difficulty, sir, said the genial frame-maker, beginning, with the aid of his assistant, to unhook the picture from the long brass chains by which it had suspended. And now, where shall we carry it to, Mr. Gray? I will show you the way, Mr. Ashton, if you will kindly follow me. Or perhaps you had better go in front. I'm afraid it is right at the top of the house. We will go up by the front staircase, as it is wider. He held the door open for them, and they passed out into the hall and began the ascent. The elaborate character of the frame had made the picture extremely bulky, and now and then, in spite of the obsequious protests of Mr. Ashton, who had a true tradesman's dislike of seeing a gentleman do anything useful, Dorian put his hand to it so as to help them. Something of a load to carry, sir, gasped the little man when they reached the top of the landing, and he wiped his shiny forehead. A terrible load to carry, murmured Dorian, as he unlocked the door that opened into the room that was to keep for him the curious secret of his life and hide his soul from the eyes of men. He had not entered the room for more than 4 years, not, indeed, since he had used it first as a playroom when he was a child, and then as a study when he grew somewhat older. It was a large, well-proportioned room which had been specially built by the last Lord Gerard for the use of the little nephew whom, himself being childless, and perhaps for other reasons, he had always hated and desired to keep at a distance. It did not appear to Dorian to have much changed. There was the huge Italian caisson, with its fantastically painted panels and its tarnished gilt moldings, in which he had so often hidden himself as a boy. There was the satinwood bookcase filled with his dog-eared school books. On the wall behind it was hanging the same ragged Flemish tapestry where a faded king and queen were playing chess in a garden, while a company of hawkers rode by carrying hooded birds on their gauntleted wrists. How well he recalled it all! Every moment of his lonely childhood came back to him as he looked around. He remembered the stainless purity of his boyish life, and it seemed horrible to him that it was here that the fatal portrait was to be hidden away. How little he had thought in those dead days of all that was in store for him. But there was no other place in the house so secure from prying eyes as this. He had the key, and no one else could enter it. Beneath its purple pall, the face painted on the canvas could grow bestial, sodden, and unclean. What did it matter? No one could see it. He himself would not see it. Why should he watch the hideous corruption of his soul? He kept his youth, that was enough. And besides, might not his nature grow finer after all? There was no reason that the future should be so full of shame. Some love might come across his life and purify him and shield him from sins that seemed to be already stirring in spirit and in flesh, those curious unpictured sins whose very mystery lent them their subtlety and their charm. Perhaps some day the cruel look would have passed away from the scarlet, sensitive mouth, and he might show to the world Basil Hallward's masterpiece. No, that was impossible. The thing upon the canvas was growing old hour by hour and week by week. Even if it escaped the hideousness of sin, the hideousness of age was in store for it. The cheeks would become hollow or flaccid. Yellow crow's feet would creep around the fading eyes and make them horrible. The hair would lose its brightness. The mouth would gape or droop, would be foolish or gross, as the mouths of old men are. There would be the wrinkled throat, the cold blue veined hands, the twisted body that he remembered in the uncle who had been so stern to him in his boyhood. The picture had to be concealed. There was no help for it. "Bring it in, Mr. Ashton, please," he said wearily, turning round. "I'm sorry I kept you so long. I was thinking of something else." "Always glad to have a rest, Mr. Gray," answered the frame maker, who was still gasping for breath. "Where shall we put it?" "Oh, anywhere. Here, this'll do. I don't want to have to hang it up. Just lean it against the wall. Thanks." "Might one look at the work of art, sir?" Dorian started. "It would not interest you, Mr. Ashton," he said, keeping his eye on the man. He felt ready to leap upon him and fling him to the ground if he dared to lift the gorgeous hanging that concealed the secret of his life. "I won't trouble you any more now. I am much obliged for your kindness in coming round." Not at all, Mr. Gray. Ever ready to do anything for you, sir." And Mr. Ashton tramped downstairs, followed by his assistant, who glanced back at Dorian with a look of shy wonder in his rough, uncomely face. He had never seen anyone so marvelous.